The biting wind howled incessantly, a cruel accompaniment to the gnawing hunger that gripped the Allied battalion. Deep within enemy territory, surrounded and forgotten, the relentless winter of 1944 was proving to be as formidable an adversary as the German forces themselves. Every breath was a frosty cloud, every movement a struggle against the numbing cold. Rations had dwindled to dangerously low levels weeks ago, leaving the men gaunt, their faces etched with a desperate weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The once vibrant camaraderie of soldiers had been replaced by a grim, silent struggle for survival, punctuated only by the distant cracks of enemy fire or the pitiful moans of those succumbing to hypothermia and starvation. Their supply lines, once a lifeline of hope and sustenance, had been ruthlessly severed, leaving them isolated, a small, shivering island of resistance in a vast, hostile sea. The energy required for even the most basic tasks, like digging deeper into the frozen earth for shelter, was becoming a luxury they could no longer afford. Morale, a fragile thing at the best of times, was plummeting with each passing, foodless day. Hope, thin as the ice on the puddles outside their foxholes, threatened to shatter completely under the weight of their impossible situation. Miles away, nestled in a valley seemingly untouched by the ravages of war, lived Thomas. He was a farmer, unremarkable in appearance, yet renowned in his small, isolated village for his decidedly unconventional agricultural methods. His family had tilled these same fields for generations, passing down a legacy of techniques that often bordered on the eccentric. While other farmers relied on modern fertilizers and predictable crop rotations, Thomas stubbornly adhered to his ancestral ways, concocting strange-smelling mixtures from local plants, rock dust, and fermented animal byproducts that he lovingly referred to as his stupid fertilizer mix. The villagers often chuckled behind his back, shaking their heads at his peculiar devotion to what they considered archaic practices. Yet, year after year, Thomas's crops were always the first to sprout, the hardiest against disease, and yielded harvests that mysteriously surpassed those of his more conventional neighbors, even in the harshest winters. He was a quiet, unassuming man, more comfortable talking to his soil than to people, his hands calloused from a lifetime of labor, his eyes reflecting a deep, earthy wisdom that few bothered to acknowledge. No one, not even Thomas himself, could have imagined that his humble, seemingly foolish farm practices would soon play a pivotal, almost miraculous role in the grim theater of war unfolding so close by. Back at the besieged encampment, the situation had deteriorated into a full-blown crisis. Messages sent through the few remaining runners were intercepted, and desperate attempts to signal for aerial resupply missions were met with empty skies. The sheer cold was an enemy in itself, draining what little caloric energy the men consumed. Frostbite became a common affliction, and the medical tents, already ill-equipped, were overwhelmed. The battalion commander, Colonel Davies, a seasoned veteran who had seen his share of impossible odds, now found himself staring at a bleak reality. Starvation was no longer a distant threat, it was a creeping certainty, a silent killer far more insidious than any enemy bullet. Whispers of a forced, suicidal breakout attempt began to circulate among the officers, a desperate last resort to escape their icy tomb. The weight of his men's lives pressed heavily on the colonel's shoulders, each skeletal face a stark reminder of their impending doom. He knew that without a miracle, without some unforeseen intervention, his battalion was as good as lost. Before we delve into the extraordinary, almost unbelievable story of how Thomas, the unassuming farmer, became the improbable savior of an entire battalion, remember to subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss more untold stories of resilience, ingenuity, and the human spirit's capacity to triumph against all odds. The battalion's plight deepened with each passing day. The icy grip of winter tightened its hold, transforming the landscape into a desolate, unforgiving expanse of white. Soldiers, once vibrant and resolute, moved like ghosts, their energy sapped by the constant battle against hunger and cold. Their uniforms, frayed and thin, offered scant protection against the biting wind that seemed to cut straight to the bone. Sentry duty became an agonizing ordeal, men huddling in their frozen posts, eyes scanning the bleak horizon for movement, but their bodies trembling not just from fear, but from the profound weakness that had settled deep within their bones. Patrols, once executed with a sharp, decisive efficiency, were now slow and infrequent, their effectiveness severely compromised by the men's diminished capacity. The enemy, it seemed, sensed this vulnerability. Their probing attacks grew bolder, their snipers more daring, forcing the beleaguered soldiers to expend precious energy defending their ever-shrinking perimeter. Colonel Davies, pacing his frigid command tent, the maps spread before him now less a guide and more a stark reminder of their entrapment, recognized the grim arithmetic of their situation. Every man lost to illness, every ounce of strength surrendered to starvation, pushed them closer to an unthinkable end. The whispered plan of a breakthrough, once a desperate last resort, now felt increasingly like an inevitability, a suicidal charge born of pure, unadulterated desperation. The odds of success were astronomically low, but the alternative was a slow, agonizing demise, a gradual fading into the frozen earth. The true antagonist, however, was not just the visible enemy, those faceless figures in the distance, but the relentless, suffocating blockade they maintained. Their patrols were omnipresent, a steel net drawn tight around the Allied positions, cutting off any hope of external resupply. Every road, every trail, every potential route was meticulously watched, secured, or mined. Attempts to send out small, covert teams to scout for edible wild plants or hidden caches often ended in swift, brutal encounters, further depleting their already dwindling numbers. But even if a path opened, the environment itself conspired against them. The snow fell ceaselessly, blanketing the land in feet of treacherous powder, concealing deadly ice patches and making any movement a Herculean effort. Blizzards roared through the valley with terrifying frequency, grounding reconnaissance planes and making even local foraging expeditions utterly impossible. The wind whipped up snowdrifts that swallowed men whole, turning familiar landmarks into an alien, deadly terrain. This was a war fought not just against bullets and bombs, but against the very elements, a brutal siege where nature itself was an unforgiving ally of the enemy. The unforgiving cold clawed at them, draining their strength and spirit far more effectively than any direct assault. Desperate to stem the tide of their inevitable collapse, the battalion leadership had already exhausted every conventional military solution. Rations, initially cut in half, were now microscopic, barely enough to sustain life, let alone fight a war. The men chewed on frozen roots and scavenged for anything remotely edible within their immediate, cleared perimeter, but the winter landscape offered little sustenance. Expeditions were mounted, under cover of darkness, to nearby abandoned farms in a futile hope of finding leftover crops or forgotten livestock, but these missions consistently yielded nothing but frostbite and frustration. Communication attempts, using their last remaining crackling radios, were met with static or, worse, enemy intercepts, revealing the futility of reaching out for rescue. Runners, brave and determined men, had been dispatched weeks ago, carrying vital intelligence and pleas for aid, but none had returned, swallowed by the vast, hostile wilderness or captured by the ever-vigilant enemy patrols. Each failed attempt, each conventional solution that crumbled in the face of overwhelming odds, chipped away further at their rapidly eroding hope. Colonel Davies watched his men, their eyes sunken, their movements sluggish, and understood that traditional military doctrine had failed them. They were truly alone, staring into the abyss, and the only remaining recourse seemed to be a desperate, perhaps foolish, leap of faith into the unconventional. Without a radical, unheard-of solution, their fate was sealed. The despair was a palpable thing, a heavy shroud settling over the entire encampment, when a junior officer, Lieutenant Miller, a man usually buried in logistics reports, approached Colonel Davies with an idea so outlandish it verged on insubordination. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and a desperate, almost manic, hope. He stammered, outlining his improbable proposal, to seek help from the local villagers. Davies, hunched over a flickering lamp, merely grunted, not even bothering to look up. Villagers? What could a handful of terrified civilians possibly do against a siege of this magnitude? Miller pressed on, his voice gaining a fragile conviction, mentioning a particular farmer he had heard about during pre-deployment intelligence briefings, a man named Thomas, known for his eccentric methods and strangely abundant yields. It was a whispered rumor, a local tale, nothing more. To the seasoned officers, it sounded utterly ridiculous, an act of sheer desperation born from minds frayed by hunger and hopelessness. But as Miller detailed the farmer's reputation for growing crops where others failed, even in the harshest conditions, a flicker of something, perhaps not hope, but a willingness to grasp at any straw, ignited in the colonel's weary eyes. It was a long shot, a ludicrous gamble, but with all conventional avenues exhausted, what did they have left to lose? The notion of a farmer, with his simple tools and muddy hands, providing any kind of solution to their dire military predicament was met with scorn by most of the command staff. Yet, the alternative was certain annihilation. This was not a strategic move, it was a plea, a desperate Hail Mary born of absolute, unadulterated necessity. The idea was so far-fetched it was almost suicidal, yet it was the only idea left on the table. A small, heavily armed patrol was dispatched under the cover of a brutal snowstorm, their mission a blend of reconnaissance and pure, unadulterated begging. They found Thomas in his drafty farmhouse, tending to a small, surprisingly vibrant indoor garden, completely oblivious to the war that raged just miles away. Initially, Thomas was hesitant, wary of soldiers, remembering the ridicule he often faced from outsiders who saw his methods as primitive. He listened patiently as Lieutenant Miller, shivering from the cold and the sheer audacity of his request, explained the battalion's predicament. As Miller described the starving men, the dwindling hope, Thomas's quiet demeanor shifted. A flicker of compassion, perhaps even a stubborn sense of local pride, replaced his initial apprehension. He pondered deeply, his gaze moving from the hungry soldier's face to the robust green shoots in his indoor plot. Then, almost reluctantly, he began to speak of his stupid fertilizer mix. It wasn't a secret, not really, more like a closely guarded family tradition. He explained how it was a concoction of local, nutrient-rich ingredients, a specific blend of fermented animal waste, crushed mineral-rich rocks, certain varieties of wild mountain herbs, and even finely ground bone meal. He used it, he clarified, to nourish his crops, giving them an unparalleled resilience and growth, even through the harsh winter months when other fields lay barren. His voice, initially soft, grew with a quiet passion as he described the properties of each ingredient, how they worked in synergy to create something potent, something far more than just soil enhancer. He spoke of the concentrated energy locked within, of its ability to boost vitality. Then, almost as an afterthought, a hint of a revolutionary idea in his tone, he quietly added that its potential, he believed, went far beyond merely plants. The implication hung in the cold, still air. Could such a mix, designed for the earth, nourish man as well? The military officers, listening intently now, exchanged incredulous glances. The idea was preposterous, insulting even. Use a farmer's fertilizer for human sustenance. The very notion was absurd, dangerous, and frankly, disgusting. Captain Reynolds, the patrol leader, scoffed openly. "You expect us to feed that muck to our men, farmer? Are you mad? We're fighting a war, not trying to grow prize-winning turnips." Another officer muttered about poisoning the troops, a fate worse than starvation, a disgrace to their uniform. Thomas, undeterred by their skepticism, merely held their gaze, his eyes reflecting a quiet conviction. He wasn't suggesting they eat fertilizer straight from the fields, he clarified, but a refined, concentrated version, a distillation of its most potent elements. He described a nutrient-dense paste, a product of his unique fermentation and processing methods, designed to extract the most vital compounds. But the officers were already shaking their heads, their minds closed. How could a simple man, a farmer, understand nutrition and human biology better than their trained medical staff? They saw only dirt and manure, not the concentrated essence of life Thomas described. His methods were crude, unproven, bordering on folk magic. To them, it was the delusion of a desperate man, and the thought of presenting such an idea to Colonel Davies was met with a chorus of groans and outright dismissal. It was an insult to their intelligence, a dangerous fantasy, and a waste of precious time. Thomas, however, was not easily deterred. His quiet resolve hardened into a surprising determination. He looked directly at Captain Reynolds, his gaze unwavering despite the captain's open derision. He began to explain, with a calm authority that silenced even the most vocal skeptics, the precise nutritional properties of each local ingredient. He spoke of the specific wild berries rich in vitamin C, crucial for preventing scurvy, a disease already starting to show its insidious signs among the battalion. He detailed how the carefully processed and fermented root vegetables he used were packed with complex carbohydrates and vital minerals, offering sustained energy release, unlike the fleeting boost of mere sugar. He described the finely ground bone meal, not as fertilizer, but as a natural source of calcium and phosphorus, essential for maintaining bone strength and preventing fatigue. His mix, he passionately articulated, concentrated these vital elements through a process he had refined over decades, passed down through generations. It wasn't guesswork, it was empirical knowledge, honed by observation and survival in this very terrain. He offered an undeniable challenge, his voice resonating with a newfound confidence. He would demonstrate its safety and efficacy himself. He would consume it, openly, before their very eyes. If it truly was poison, as they suggested, then he would be the first to suffer the consequences. This unexpected act of defiance, this willingness to stake his own life on his invention, momentarily stunned the skeptical officers. The raw conviction in his eyes, the deep-seated belief in his own methods, began to chip away at their stone wall of disbelief. They had seen men face death with courage, but this was a different kind of bravery, the quiet, unyielding conviction of a man who knew his craft. After a tense silence, Lieutenant Miller, seeing a glimmer of possibility, argued for a small, controlled test. What was the harm? If it worked, even partially, it could buy them invaluable time. If it failed, they were no worse off than before. Reluctantly, Colonel Davies, informed of the farmer's peculiar proposition and his bold offer, authorized a limited trial. A designated area, watched by a skeptical medical officer and a handful of grim-faced soldiers, was set up within the encampment. Thomas, with an almost ritualistic precision, began to prepare a fresh batch of his fertilizer. He painstakingly mixed the various elements, carefully grinding some, gently heating others, transforming the earthy components into a thick, dark, and surprisingly aromatic paste. He reframed it, not as a soil amendment, but as a highly concentrated nutrient paste, a term that, while still unconventional, held less immediate revulsion than fertilizer. He then scooped a generous portion onto a wooden spoon and, without a moment's hesitation, consumed it himself. He chewed slowly, his expression neutral, then offered the remaining paste to a few desperate volunteers. These were men who had nothing left to lose, their hunger overriding their fear of the unknown substance. Watching Thomas consume it first undeniably lessened their apprehension. One by one, hesitantly at first, then with increasing gulping urgency, the handful of chosen soldiers tasted the paste. Their initial reactions were a mixture of surprise and disgust. The taste was powerfully earthy, unlike anything they had ever consumed, but it was not unpleasant. And then, something remarkable happened. Within minutes, a warmth spread through their emaciated bodies. A subtle, yet undeniable, surge of energy coursed through their veins. Their eyes, once dull and lifeless, seemed to regain a spark. They felt an almost immediate, if temporary, relief from the gnawing pangs of hunger. One soldier, hollow-eyed just moments before, found himself able to stand straighter, his voice gaining strength as he declared, I feel like I could actually walk a mile." The results were surprisingly positive, providing an immediate, albeit unconventional, burst of life into their weary frames. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was a tangible improvement, a flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness. Word of the farmer's muck, and its strange effects spread like wildfire through the frigid trenches. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, then into open discussions. Soldiers, who initially scoffed, now looked with envy at the few who had participated in the test. The medical officer, though still cautious, could not deny the visible change in the volunteers. Their pallor improved, their shivering lessened, and their accounts of renewed strength were too consistent to ignore. The initial skepticism among the rank and file began to give way to a desperate yearning. The official line was still one of caution, but the raw need for sustenance was paramount. Soon, small groups of soldiers, driven by sheer hunger and the tantalizing promise of renewed vigor, began to discreetly approach Thomas, begging for a taste, a small portion of his nutrient paste. They were willing to defy orders, to risk reprimand, anything for a reprieve from the relentless grip of starvation and the promise of enough strength to fight another day. The tide of acceptance, born out of desperate necessity, was slowly but surely turning. The growing demand, once a quiet murmur, swelled into an undeniable chorus amongst the beleaguered troops. The whispers of desperate men morphing into open pleas for the farmer's miracle reached the ears of Colonel Davies with increasing urgency. He could no longer ignore the palpable shift in morale and the undeniable, if peculiar, evidence of the concoction's efficacy. After another tense meeting with his command staff, where the medical officer grudgingly admitted the positive physiological changes in the test subjects, the decision was made. The battalion command, faced with the stark reality of their dwindling options and Thomas's undeniable success, fully committed to his plan. It was a radical departure from military protocol, an admission of utter dependence on an outside, unconventional source, but it was a commitment born of survival. Thomas, no longer just a peculiar farmer, was now given an almost unprecedented authority, operating directly under the colonel's command. He became the central figure in a desperate, last-ditch effort to save the battalion. The first order of business was scaling up production, a monumental task given the wartime conditions. Runners were dispatched to the surrounding, mostly abandoned, villages, not to forage for traditional supplies, but to mobilize the remaining villagers. These brave, often elderly, men and women were asked to join the war effort in the most unexpected way, by gathering the specific, often obscure, ingredients Thomas needed. It was a logistical nightmare from the outset. Many of the wild herbs grew in remote, snow-covered valleys. The specific rock formations yielding the mineral-rich dust were often far from safe routes. Securing enough bone meal required a process of careful collection and grinding, far beyond the scope of a few men. Yet, fueled by a shared desperation and a growing belief in Thomas's quiet leadership, the villagers responded. They knew their land, they knew its secrets, and they understood the dire stakes. Thomas, with an almost saint-like patience, guided the entire process. He instructed the villagers on identifying the correct plants, the precise method for extracting the minerals, and the delicate art of his fermentation technique. He set up makeshift production lines within the relatively safer confines of the battalion's perimeter, utilizing whatever scarce resources were available. Old ammunition crates became fermentation vats, repurposed mess tins served as grinding bowls, and even captured enemy equipment was pressed into service. He faced skepticism not just from some of the grumbling soldiers who still saw him as a mere farmer, but from villagers themselves who found his specific requirements pedantic and strange. "Why this route and not that one?" they would ask, accustomed to their own simpler remedies. Thomas, however, held firm, explaining the science of his ancestors with simple, clear words, emphasizing the critical importance of each component for the final, potent mixture. He worked tirelessly, sleeping only in snatches, his hands perpetually stained with mud and the rich, dark paste, his mind constantly racing to overcome the next logistical hurdle. Winter's grip continued unabated, adding another layer of difficulty to every step of the ingredient gathering process. Blizzards could halt expeditions for days, and the risk of enemy patrols was constant. Thomas himself often accompanied the foraging parties, his deep knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable in navigating the treacherous, snow-laden landscape and avoiding detection. Slowly, arduously, the production scaled up. The initially small, desperate batches gave way to a more consistent, albeit still modest, supply. The sustained intake of Thomas's nutrient mix began to visibly alter the soldiers' condition. The first noticeable change was in their energy levels. The constant, debilitating fatigue that had plagued them for weeks began to recede. Men found themselves able to complete tasks with less effort, to stand longer on watch, to march further on patrols. Their pallor, once a sickly gray, began to take on a healthier, more robust hue. Even their ability to withstand the harsh cold seemed to improve, the nutrients apparently bolstering their internal resilience against the brutal winter. Morale, once at rock bottom, experienced a subtle, yet profound uplift. It wasn't just the physical nourishment. It was the psychological boost of having a solution, of knowing that they were actively fighting back against the insidious enemy of starvation. The spirit of the battalion, once fractured and failing, began to knit itself back together. Laughter, albeit subdued, could be heard again around the meager campfires. The tide, slowly, almost imperceptibly, was beginning to turn. The stupid fertilizer mix, once a source of ridicule, was now becoming their salvation, an unlikely weapon in a war of attrition where every calorie, every ounce of strength, counted. The revitalized battalion, now fueled by Thomas's extraordinary invention, began to stir from its prolonged, desperate stupor. The sustained nourishment, once considered an eccentric farmer's folly, had transformed them. Patrols, previously sluggish and infrequent, resumed with a renewed vigor that surprised even their own commanders. Soldiers moved with a purposeful stride, their movements precise, their reactions sharper, their eyes once again scanning the snow-laden landscape with alertness rather than weary resignation. The energy that had been sapped by hunger and cold was slowly flowing back into their limbs, allowing them to cover more ground, maintain longer watches, and engage in skirmishes with a ferocity that had been absent for weeks. This newfound resilience, born from the depths of desperation, allowed them to slowly regain lost tactical ground and begin disrupting the enemy's seemingly impenetrable blockade. The improvements were not just physical. The psychological impact was perhaps even more profound, injecting a crucial dose of confidence into men who had once felt utterly defeated. They were no longer merely surviving, they were actively fighting back. This sudden, inexplicable resurgence of the Allied forces sent ripples of confusion through the enemy ranks. Their intelligence reports had consistently indicated a battalion on the brink of collapse, starved, freezing, and utterly isolated. They had meticulously cut off every supply line, confident that time and the harsh winter would do their work for them. Yet, the enemy command now received baffling dispatches. Aggressive patrols were probing their lines, small but determined attacks were chipping away at their perimeter defenses, and the overall combat effectiveness of the besieged unit seemed to be inexplicably climbing. Enemy scouts reported seeing soldiers who moved with an almost unnatural endurance, men who seemed less affected by the biting cold than they should have been. These reports directly contradicted all their established intelligence, leading to frantic internal inquiries and accusations of incompetence among their own intelligence officers. They knew the supply lines were still severed, verified through aerial reconnaissance and ground patrols. So where was this renewed strength coming from? It defied all conventional military logic. The enemy commanders, baffled and increasingly frustrated, reviewed their strategies. They couldn't understand how a unit cut off from all traditional sustenance could not only endure but actually ramp up its operational tempo. They considered the possibility of airdrops they somehow missed, or a secret underground tunnel system, but both theories were quickly dismissed as improbable given the terrain and the thoroughness of their blockade. The unexpected resilience of the Allied battalion was an enigma, a tactical puzzle they couldn't solve, and it bred a growing unease within their command structure. The psychological warfare element was completely unintentional, yet incredibly effective. By defying all expectations of a starving, defeated enemy, the Allied soldiers were sowing doubt and confusion where they had expected certainty and easy victory. The enemy's confidence in their blockade began to wane, replaced by a cautious paranoia. What hidden reserve, what secret weapon, could possibly be sustaining this besieged force? They knew their enemy was resourceful, but this phenomenon was beyond their comprehension. Amidst this tactical upheaval, Thomas, the quiet farmer, found himself the unlikely recipient of a profound and widespread respect. Once mocked, then grudgingly tolerated, he was now revered. His very presence in the encampment, quietly overseeing the production of his life-sustaining mix, was a source of comfort and strength for the men. Soldiers, who had initially scoffed at the idea of consuming his stupid fertilizer, now approached him with deference, offering small gestures of gratitude and seeking his advice on even the most mundane matters. Officers, particularly Colonel Davies and Lieutenant Miller, who had championed his cause, treated him not as a civilian helping out, but as an indispensable part of their command, a vital asset without whom their battalion would have surely perished. His quiet resilience, his unwavering belief in his methods, and most importantly, his ingenious, unconventional solution had saved them from the brink. Thomas's calm demeanor, even under the immense pressure of wartime production, earned him the admiration of all. He was no soldier, yet he faced the dangers and hardships of the siege with the same quiet fortitude as the most seasoned veteran. His unique contributions, once the subject of jokes, were now whispered about with awe and gratitude. The stupid fertilizer mix had not only nourished their bodies but had also healed their spirits, reigniting their will to fight. Thomas, the unassuming farmer, had become an accidental legend within the ranks, his name uttered with a reverence typically reserved for decorated heroes. He had proven that true strength and ingenuity could emanate from the most unexpected places, under the most dire circumstances. The war was far from over, but thanks to him, the battalion had been granted a reprieve, a second chance to fight and survive. The unexpected resurgence of the Allied battalion, fueled by Thomas's extraordinary nutrient paste, culminated in a critical encounter that would define their survival. Colonel Davies, emboldened by his men's renewed strength and the enemy's evident confusion, initiated a daring mission to break a segment of the siege line that had been particularly problematic, securing a vital crossroads that would allow for eventual resupply and a potential avenue of escape. This was no mere patrol, it was a full-scale assault, a desperate gamble that required every soldier to perform at their absolute peak. The plan was audacious, involving a multi-pronged night attack under the cover of a fierce blizzard, designed to exploit the enemy's disarray and the element of surprise. Each man was issued a concentrated ration of Thomas's mix, a dark, potent paste that they now consumed with a grim determination, knowing it was the source of their renewed vitality. The air crackled with a cold, desperate energy, a mixture of fear and a newfound, almost reckless, confidence. As the blizzard howled, muffling the sounds of their advance, the battalion moved with a stealth and speed that would have been impossible weeks prior. The freezing wind, once a debilitating adversary, now seemed merely an inconvenience. The deep snow, which had once bogged them down, was traversed with a surprising agility. When they finally engaged the enemy positions, the fight was brutal and unforgiving. The German defenders, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the assault and the unexpected endurance of their supposedly starving adversaries, fought back with desperate resolve. This was the turning point, the moment where Thomas's stupid fertilizer mix transitioned from a mere nutritional supplement to a decisive strategic weapon. During the intense, close-quarters battle, the soldiers' sustained endurance and fighting spirit proved absolutely decisive. Where, in weeks past, exhaustion would have claimed them after an hour of combat, they now pushed through, their muscles burning but not failing, their minds sharp despite the chaos. A machine gun nest, thought impregnable, was overwhelmed by a relentless charge. Soldiers, who should have been shivering and slow, moved with a surprising agility, outmaneuvering their larger, better-fed opponents. One particularly harrowing moment saw a small squad pinned down by relentless enemy fire. Instead of succumbing to fatigue and despair, as they surely would have before, they maintained their position, exchanging fire for what felt like an eternity, fueled by the steady, internal furnace that Thomas's mix provided. Their sheer stubbornness and unwavering stamina broke the enemy's will to hold that critical position. The commander of the enemy forces, observing the strange, almost superhuman tenacity of the Allied soldiers, was utterly baffled. These were not the emaciated, defeated men he expected. These were fighters, relentless and unyielding, their resilience defying all logic and intelligence reports. The breakthrough was achieved against all odds, the crossroads secured, and a significant portion of the enemy's blockade shattered, not just by superior tactics or firepower, but by the sheer, unexpected physical and mental fortitude of the Allied soldiers. The confirmation of the mission's success reverberated through the Allied High Command like a shockwave. The securement of the crossroads was a pivotal strategic victory, opening a desperately needed corridor for supply convoys and allowing for the first real communication with the outside world in months. The enemy's once impenetrable blockade had been not just breached, but shattered in a key sector, their strategic advantage severely diminished. Detailed after-action reports, though initially met with disbelief by some, consistently highlighted the extraordinary endurance of the battalion, attributing it directly to the unconventional nutrient paste provided by the local farmer. The stupid fertilizer mix, mocked and dismissed at the outset, had directly contributed to a significant military success, proving its incredible, unconventional power not just to sustain life, but to turn the tide of battle. It was a victory forged in desperation, fueled by ingenuity, and sealed by the unyielding spirit of men who had found an unlikely savior in the most unexpected of places. The legend of Thomas and his miraculous concoction had now moved beyond whispers within the ranks. It was becoming a verified, vital part of their war effort. The immediate crisis was averted. The enemy blockade, once so suffocating, now lay in tatters. With the crossroads firmly in Allied hands, a steady stream of trucks laden with vital supplies, communication equipment, and fresh troops began to reach the beleaguered battalion. The sight of the supply convoys rumbling through the snow-laden pass brought tears to the eyes of battle-hardened soldiers, a visceral confirmation that their ordeal was finally over. Hot food, proper medical care, and the simple luxury of a warm, dry uniform replaced the bitter cold, gnawing hunger, and tattered rags that had been their constant companions for so long. The battalion, once teetering on the precipice of annihilation, was saved, pulled back from the brink by an act of ingenuity and sheer desperation. Thomas, the unassuming farmer, was hailed as an unlikely hero, his stupid fertilizer, now revered as a wartime miracle, acknowledged as the decisive factor in their survival and ultimate victory. His concoction had not merely sustained life, it had revitalized an entire fighting force, enabling them to achieve what military strategists had deemed impossible. Amidst the celebrations and the clamor of returning normalcy, Thomas remained remarkably unchanged. He politely declined the accolades, the offers of military honors, and the propositions to analyze and commercially produce his nutrient paste on a grand scale. His quiet nature, his humility, remained his defining traits. As quickly as he had been thrust into the epicenter of the war, he retreated back to the familiar solace of his small, isolated farm. His work was done. He had fulfilled his purpose, lending his unique, ancestral knowledge to a cause far greater than himself. He returned to his fields, to his beloved soil, to the rhythms of nature that had always guided his life. Yet, he was forever changed. The quiet farmer who had once been ridiculed for his unconventional ways was now a man who carried the profound, unspoken gratitude of hundreds of soldiers, a man who knew the true weight of human desperation and the immense power of resilience. He had witnessed firsthand the horrors of war and the incredible strength of the human spirit when pushed to its absolute limits. His story, however, did not end with his return to rural obscurity. It became a legend, whispered first among the men of the battalion, then spreading throughout the Allied forces, a testament to the fact that solutions can, and often do, come from the most unexpected places. Thomas, the farmer, became a symbol of ingenuity, perseverance, and the underestimated power of local, traditional knowledge. His fertilizer became a wartime fable, an example of how unconventional thinking, when coupled with a deep understanding of one's environment, could defy military logic and turn the tide of battle. It served as a stark reminder that in times of crisis, the most sophisticated strategies can sometimes be outmaneuvered by the simplest, most profound truths. The military, often rigid in its protocols, learned a valuable lesson from a man who had never worn a uniform. The legend of the farmer and his miracle mix served as a humble, yet powerful, narrative within the annals of the war, a stark contrast to the grand tales of generals and their strategic victories. It was a story of a quiet hero, whose impact resonated far beyond the battlefield, a testament to the extraordinary contributions of ordinary people in times of extraordinary need. His humble farm was a symbol not of backwardness, but of deep-rooted wisdom, capable of yielding not just robust crops, but also the very essence of survival. If this incredible tale of ingenuity, resilience, and an unlikely hero's impact on the course of a war inspired you, if it sparked a flicker of appreciation for those unsung contributors to history, then we urge you to do something amazing. Smash that like button, share this video with everyone you know who might be uplifted by such a profound story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary, untold stories from the deepest corners of history. We are constantly searching for these hidden gems, these narratives of human strength and unexpected triumph. What other hidden heroes, what other acts of quiet courage, what other seemingly impossible feats born from desperation and ingenuity should we uncover next? Let us know your thoughts, your suggestions, and your own stories in the comments section below. Your input directly helps us bring these forgotten voices and pivotal moments back to life. Every subscription, every like, every share helps us continue this journey of discovery, illuminating the incredible power of the human spirit against all odds.